They always tell you to be ready in the face of a natural disaster. But what can you do when an earthquake strikes in the middle of the night and all communications and roads are lost? You might be fine, but on the other side of that mountain, thousands of people might depend on your help for their survival. How do you start, and where do you finish?
From the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea.
The earthquake struck between 3 and 4 a.m.
4 days after the 7.5 magnitude earthquakes.
A woman who lost 7 children and her husband.
The biggest frustration here is that help isn't coming as fast as it should from Port Moresby.
The response mechanism, it's too slow. There's no sense of urgency.
Almost nobody is talking about the dire situation here.
Why has the world largely ignored this disaster?
A family is still buried under this landslip. Villagers have little hope of finding their remains.
If you don't respond in a timely manner, then there are loss of life.
The pain of losing loved ones is still raw.
Of course, there isn't much that we can do to prevent natural disasters from happening. But there is a lot that we can do as a global community to be prepared at a time of trouble. This documentary will be the story of how this happened in Papua New Guinea, a country where traditional cultures and developments worth billions of dollars sit side by side and have come together, perhaps as they have never done before.
There's still a lot of things that we need to learn about our own planet. And because we can't actually go to the center of the Earth, we need to be able to study the physics, the processes that go on, and part of that is seismology.
The Earth is billions of years old, right? And that crust on the outside is constantly moving, and it's moving with a number of tectonic plates. The Pacific plate is one. If you look at the Atlantic, in the Atlantic Ocean, we've got 2 plates that are actually moving apart from each other. And we look around that every day and we think, well, it's formed, it's all static, nothing's changing. And every now and then there's an earthquake. And when the earthquake happens, we realize, well, wait a minute, the Earth is still moving.
If you look back at the geological history of Papua New Guinea, only 10 million years ago, we were depositing limestone, so effectively coral reef and all the things that go behind that in the ocean. And it was continuous all the way past the northern side of where present-day Papua New Guinea is. That was all underwater only 10 million years ago.
$10 million years ago is basically recent history in geological terms. And the youth of this land is the reason why natural resources are so abundant in Papua New Guinea, especially the ones deep below the crust. And to tap into these resources, oil and gas companies have to drill in extremely challenging environments, like in the highland regions of Papua New Guinea. A part of the country that was isolated from the rest of the world until the 1930s, culturally as well as socially, and where infrastructure remains chronically behind the rest of the nation.
One of the behaviours or conditions or circumstances that surprises most people coming to Papua New Guinea is there has been so much money from the various projects over the last 3 or 4 decades. Where has it all gone? Why can't I see the visible, the tangible evidence of these millions of kina? Why don't I see fantastic housing, fantastic hospitals outside? And the barrier to that is it means you've got to access land, and land is held and owned by corporate units we call clans. So it's very difficult for a member of Clan B to come and live on somebody's Clan A land, because in the event of dispute or fighting or disagreement, Clan A will say to those members of Clan B, go away, this is not your land.
Land is always a sensitive issue in Papua New Guinea, and the epicenter of the earthquake that struck this country on February the 26th happened in the heart of the Huli territory, an ethnic group known for their confrontational nature and fierce tribal warfare. The country's largest deposits of hydrocarbons is seated below their land, which they lease to a group of resource companies led by ExxonMobil, Oil Search, and the national oil company Kumul Petroleum, among others. They developed a multi-billion-dollar project to extract gas and send it down to the coast via a network of pipelines running over 700 kilometers long. An already volatile environment was going to be thrown completely out of balance by the earthquake overnight.
Oil Search has operated in PNG for a long time. We've been operating the oil fields themselves for the last 15 years or so. But we've been within PNG since 1929, been in and part of the country for a long time, which I think helps us in those operations. But it's a unique environment. In PNG, we've got jungles, we've got mountains, and we've got an environment to operate in which is underdeveloped, right? It's one of the less well-developed nations in the world, and how to make sure our operations happen as efficiently as possible in that environment can be pretty tough.
Logistics and rugged terrain are a serious challenge for anybody operating in remote areas of Papua New Guinea. But tribal conflicts among the Huli tribes, who are dominant in the Hela province, is actually an even bigger obstacle, as it interferes with almost any form of development. The Tari Provincial Hospital is an example of that. Now supported by the Oil Search Foundation, who works in conjunction with the Provincial Health Authority, it has been difficult to keep medical staff here, as naturally, these doctors and nurses are worried about their own security in the midst of constant fighting.
As I say, I know this has been a very, very challenging time. Of all the places I see around Papua New Guinea, Hela remains the most challenging. The difficult mental circumstances of dealing with gunfire, dealing with tribal fighting, and dealing with the earthquake. It has been a very difficult 6 months for you. And of all the places I say around PNG that I see, this has been the most challenging. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for your dedication.
I think that the tension of the earthquake probably exacerbated things, but it was an old age clan violence. But what that did is it created a problem with the services. You know, we worked so hard straight after the earthquake to get the hospital up and running, fixing the tanks, setting the tanks up and running, making sure the water works, getting the power back on, finally getting the communications back on, getting the staff to start working and being ready, and then this clan violence escalated.
The interpretation from the elders and the local interpretation would be that these guys are encroaching into our territory without paying any respects and creating a lot of disharmony. Any event of conflict, whether caused by humans or nature, will be interpreted as mining being a contributing factor, not the sole necessarily, but a contributing factor.
Conflict that always exists and are not necessarily negative would be sorted through local infrastructures of priests, norms and behavior and accepted values. those do not necessarily apply any longer because there are new factors that came in. So you have a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the opportunistic behavior prevails.
But without a doubt, I think the people are they're more stressed as a result of the earthquake. You have a disaster like this, you look for someone to blame, right? You look for, the key question, why did this happen? And there isn't really an answer that you can give to why did this happen. I can wax lyrical about geology and tectonic plates and the Pacific Ring of Fire, but that doesn't really answer the fundamental question for people, which is, why did this happen now? Why did it happen to me?
No. When I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning advising that the Taree trip was cancelled because there's been an earthquake and Taree airstrip was closed. And I was like, must be serious for us not to go to the trip because, the monthly board meetings are regular things that we do as Peter Bottoms, the chairman of the board. So I immediately turned to Facebook to see if there really was an earthquake up in Taree. And, surely at that time in the morning, people were already putting pictures of, buildings that was lopsided, hearing people screaming and not knowing what was happening.
It happened in my province and, of course, in Ella province as well. So a lot of families and friends are based around those communities where the earthquake took place. So I obviously got a call from the community first. My telephone numbers are very accessible to all my people. So it was quite a shocking moment, and it is, of course, one of those moments in our country's history. Just like the tsunami in Aitape, that is an event that will be remembered for many, many years.
I was actually at home on my way to the United States for a meeting, and I got a call it was really within half an hour of the earthquake hitting from our operations group that had told me that an earthquake had hit the facility. And at that time, because it was close to 4 o'clock in the morning, we didn't have a full appreciation of what the impact was. At that time and that call, there's a few things and a few moments in your life that you just never, ever forget.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Well, photographer and filmmaker Thomas Nybo joins us now on the phone from the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea.
This is largely a forgotten disaster. Almost nobody is talking about the dire situation here in the highlands, and I think a big part of the problem is that these affected areas are among the most remote communities on the planet. And also, there's not much of an international media presence on a day-to-day situation. So in these areas, I had to fly into some of these villages by helicopter. The roads sometimes don't exist, or they're covered in SUV-sized boulders from landslides triggered by the earthquake. Yet the story is some 270,000 people, many of them children, are in need of urgent assistance.
Most of the older people there had never seen an earthquake in their lives. It was quite scary, quite traumatic for them to go through this experience, to see their houses being destroyed, their whole villages being covered by a landslide. It wasn't just this particular incident, it was the aftershocks that were very scary for the people.
The earthquake happened up in the southern highlands and Hela regions of Papua New Guinea, and it affected Hela, Southern Highlands, Western Province, Gulf Province, affected multiple provinces in PNG from the shaking that comes from that.
I was coming up, so I got up as quickly as I could. I was in Australia when it happened, and the Qantas hostess said, "Why are you going to PNG?" I said, "I'm trying to get up there to help with the earthquake." And she said, "Was there an earthquake?" You know, this was a few days after this very significant event. And again, whilst you didn't see the massive collapse of buildings because the infrastructure is just not built up, people were terribly affected. Entire villages were wiped away. Entire villages.
Sedimentation in the river was such that it dislodged tons and tons of timber, then slowly went down and created what we call log dams, which water built up behind, and then they'd break and that water would rush down the river and destroyed gardens, it destroyed houses, etc., along the sides of the rivers. It made it very dangerous. If you were in a canoe down there and this big wall of water's coming down, you were more or less history.
It's a mess. The whole mountains, I grew up thinking, these are solid rocks. When I went closer, it's been shaken and broken and, smashed into pieces. They're just lost. They don't know what has hit them. And it kept coming, all the aftershocks. I asked my mother, what did she think? She thought it has ended.
As the first news finally emerged from the affected areas, bringing to light the humanitarian crisis at hand, the public opinion turned to the government and to any other organization asking for an immediate response in order to save thousands of communities left without food and water and no contact with the outside world.
Plus 66, Roger, clear to Ypsilanti via direct, maintain 1000.
Class 66, destination, yep, landing.
We had the helicopters, we had the logistics and supply chain that was still working. And we were the only people, frankly, who could actually make a difference in the first few weeks of in a post-earthquake world. So there was no other option. What are we going to do? Stand back and not do anything? We come from just next door. We are your neighbours.
When things like this happen, our immediate reaction is, well, okay, we're we're in the midst of a problem, but what about our communities? What's happening with them? And so we were able to sort of understand fairly quickly that, there was a lot of death out there, there was a lot of destruction, and we need to do something to help our communities. At the end of the day, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. You can't pick up the phone and call 000. There is no emergency services that can come and help, so you have to help yourself.
Part of our effort was absolutely working with the government and working with government agencies. Now, the reality was that many of the government agencies had no capacity to do too much on the ground. Their communications were down, they struggled to know what was wrong out there, they really couldn't get out into the villages and actually deliver very much. A big positive was that Moro airstrip was open. So we actually could fly people in and out. We had helicopters on the ground. I think we had over 30 helicopters available to us in the Highlands, and really understand what the needs were very early.
Whenever an earthquake occurs, in Papua New Guinea or in any other part of the world, governments are usually blamed for reacting too slow and for not reaching people in desperate need of help.
What's your point of order? Facebook. When he should be answering me direct about what rightfully I know. Order. Can he answer me? Because I'm asking about my share of money.
He's answering the question. I think if he cares to check with his treasury and stop wasting his time on Facebook, I'm certain that he will know that this money is already made available, in fact, within weeks. And also, government within days has made a commitment for over the next 3 or 4 years, 450 million kina. It's not an easy task to rebuilding communities that have been destroyed, and I think it does not require to be politicized, so that our suffering of our people are being undermined by a political process.
I think what has been challenging over the last few years is the impact that commodity prices have had on the project and the revenues for the government, which is quite a bit different to other countries as well when you think about it, because it's unusual that you have an increase in expenditure requirement at the same time that funding is also taken away.
Bill Hamblin was the man responsible for managing disaster relief on behalf of the Papua New Guinean government. He had to coordinate the defense force and the police, as well as managing the public's expectations to see a fast and efficient recovery.
Well, I think people say, can you be prepared for a natural disaster? And the answer to that is no. You can't predict when an earthquake is going to happen. As an example of that, you look at Lombok in Indonesia as we speak. No one was prepared for that. But you can be more prepared so that we can have pre-positioned supplies in various areas that we can get out there quickly and have the capability to get those supplies to an area quickly and to respond effectively.
Where is our MP? Or our governor? Or even Prime Minister, government of today? We are crying here.
A lot of people have criticized the government for not acting quickly. But if you were on the ground at the time, you would understand the difficulty that the police were facing, the difficulties that the provincial administration was facing, because they virtually had very little to work with. They had vehicles going in between, but then you had roads that were damaged. They couldn't go further. You had to also deal with the security problems that existed. So it would be, in my view, a bit unfair to say the government didn't do anything.
From the 450 million allocated by the national government to an operating trust fund account.
When I took office, I was asked to go and get relief supplies immediately, but we have no money made available, so I have to go and get it on credit. Now, trying to get stores on credit in PNG is a couple of million kinas worth is a pretty onerous task, so we were able to manage that. So while I sympathise with the people who say it was too slow, it was as fast as, I can assure you, it was as fast as we could possibly do it.
Medical assistance were flown in by the Australian Air Force yesterday.
Natural disasters are happening all the time. It doesn't matter where you live, whether it's flooding or rising sea levels or volcanic eruption. That is happening every day. So what level of funding is enough?
As I speak today, my mind goes to a place I visited in the foothills of Mount Bosavi. I think it's called Huai Village. Yeah, about 5 kilometers up. That's like in the middle of nowhere. The mothers and children are still recovering from the tremor, and mountains are still falling. Their houses are sunk, and they've never even felt the presence of government before. And the earthquake gave an opportunity for government and the multinationals who are operating in and around the area to appreciate that there's still people out there in pockets of hinterlands of our country who have not been visited by government or even the multinationals before.
The limited knowledge that we had of those two provinces meant that we did not understand necessarily the dynamics of what pre-existed the earthquake. The level of intensity, animosity, the fluid dynamics of the tribal conflict that existed. One of the other big challenges was that as much as we had limited understanding, so did the other international organizations.
Relationships between neighboring countries are always complex. But the emotional attachment that comes with a common history usually plays an important factor at a time of trouble. And in a region like the South Pacific, where there are oceans and great distances separating nations, international cooperation seems to take on a different dimension.
Oh, 235, 2 in a second, clear for takeoff.
During the relief effort in Papua New Guinea, the Australian Defence Force, as well as New Zealand, lent large military aircraft to deliver tons of supplies to remote communities. Together with the United Nations, they played a vital role in supporting the Papua New Guinean government in the initial stages of the recovery.
It's very, very important in any such event that you always respect the government, the sovereign governments of the nation involved, and you follow their lead, you offer support to them, and you are guided in what you contribute by their needs and by the way in which they ask you to contribute. Unfortunately, many countries in our region have both experience of the effects of natural disasters. Australia feels them as well in terms of bushfires, floods, cyclones, and on occasions, the very long, slow effects of very, very serious drought.
One of the countries that has suffered the most from natural disasters is unfortunately Japan. Like Papua New Guinea, this island nation sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire and has had its foundations shaken several times in the past and even in recent years by 9.0 magnitude earthquakes followed by devastating tsunamis. Although Japan has learned how to cope with these forces of nature with strict building codes and regulations, they still appreciate the importance of international cooperation, perhaps like nobody else does.
A few years ago, I think everybody in the world remembers back to 2011 March, we had a huge earthquake happened, northeast part of Japan.
Breaking news, a violent earthquake off Japan's northeast coast has rocked.
Japan is quite literally shaken to its core.
It was absolutely unlike anything I've ever experienced before. I've been living here for 8 years now.
I was working in Tokyo, but even in Tokyo, we felt the big shake in the building. I was so scared at the time. I heard the earthquake in PNG is almost the same, the magnitude of the Great Eastern Japanese earthquake. So I easily imagined how huge the damage were.
97.9 quake was upgraded to an 8.8.
At that time, whole the world helped Japan to support, anything they can do. One of the country is Papua New Guinea. They immediately reacted, and they gave us the help for donations, for financial support, which we never forget about it.
In Japan or in Papua New Guinea, each natural disaster has a story of its own. This was certainly the case operating in such a remote region like the highlands of Papua New Guinea.
One of the significant complications in this particular event was the limited road network was essentially, for a period of time, wiped out. And so isolated areas became cut-off areas. You can do wonderful work in humanitarian assistance that never gets to the people who need it because you can't cover the last mile. And in this particular case, in Papua New Guinea, it had to be using rotary wing.
It doesn't matter if you're a government or one of the most important resource companies in the world. Nobody can do it alone when facing a massive earthquake. It is always about teamwork. And in Papua New Guinea, in the midst of the struggle, countless institutions and individuals stepped in to help. One of them was Mal Smith, a former helicopter pilot and governor of the Eastern Highlands province. He had the opportunity to discover the unspoiled interior of Papua New Guinea by helicopter, practically the only way to penetrate some of the most remote and rugged areas in the world.
Late '69, I got posted to Papua New Guinea. There were 6 helicopters and only 2 pilots, so I spent most of my time in the bush, which is exhilarating. In those days in the bush, no one wore clothes. I mean, the last tribe I found was the Hagahai in 1992. They see a helicopter, they thought the helicopter was alive. They see the antenna at the front and say, oh, man helicopter. They see the exhaust at the back, oh, lady helicopter. They couldn't work out if it was a male or female, but it had to be alive because it flew. They'd even bring food for the helicopter. All these entities got together, but the leader of this thing was Peter Botten and Oil Search. They were the ones that reacted immediately. We didn't get the army here or the government agencies here for 1 or 2 days later, but Peter Botten initiated it immediately, and you've got to give him full marks for that.
It was a kind of unique situation in a way that the earthquakes happened up in the highlands, which are very remote, and both Oil Search and ExxonMobil, they understood the communities that, surrounded their operations. So there was that trust built there. And, I mean, with anything, it is the trust and respect that comes from people-to-people contact that's important.
Houses were completely destroyed. Roads were completely blocked off. People had these psychological effects where they could not be able to go out and look for food. So it was watchers who were there first. And then all the other line stakeholders, including the state, they also came in.
To get to those remote areas without the transportation and the logistics that's needed was difficult, so Oil Search was very much at the front line. It is something unique in its sense, but like any good neighbor, when you are in need of help and you are there to help, Oil Search came to the forefront, and in this instance, they were among the first to respond, and that is very much appreciated. Yeah.
Anybody who has survived an earthquake seems to have a very personal recollection of those dramatic moments, as if natural disasters are able to leave a distinct mark on our outlook of life, making us wonder about the things that we may take for granted.
It was really terrifying, and I don't want another one. I still think of it now. We had an earthquake, little tremor 2 nights ago. your life does flash in front of you. I mean, when I got home a couple of weeks later, you start taking stock of what's right in your life. You know, what are you doing the right thing with all of the things you've got going at the moment? I mean, life's too short. You know, we're nearly finished that night, so maybe it's time to relax a bit and maybe tell the people around you that, you know, you love them a bit more than you maybe did before. You know, all those good things, and closer to mortality.
There was no panic, but there was just absolute quiet, I think, because a lot of the people here had never experienced so they probably froze in their rooms. A lot of people stayed in the rooms, not knowing what to do. I think they were all frozen into silence.
We were just waiting for the green light from the management to say what we were going to do. But all the girls were like, they wanted to go. Only myself and my other colleague, Fiona, the two of us left on site. Mostly it's the fear of the darkness because we didn't have power in our rooms for like 4 days. And we had torches when we slept at night. But we didn't really sleep because of the aftershocks were continuing, like every half an hour you'd have an aftershock. So we didn't sleep basically for like 3 nights.
Despite the effort of all the people who stayed behind to help, the resource companies involved did not carry out the relief mission without some difficulties. Not only because of the logistical challenges, but also because of the rumors that suddenly appeared on social media speculating that the earthquake had been caused by the extensive drilling of natural gas.
This parliament is divided on what caused the earthquake.
A discussion that made its way onto the floor of the national parliament and spread like fire across the local communities.
We will ask the Australian government to provide us with an independent report.
EFIC has substantially financed the gas project. The Australian government as shareholder would not be independent.
The same people who they were trying to help were now accusing them of causing this natural disaster.
This is a 7.5 earthquake we're talking about. Ones that would occur reasonably regularly would be 3 or 4 in magnitude, maybe a few of 5, right? But really not much in the historical record. So I think it's completely understandable that people would look at it and say, you guys with your oil and gas operations are new up here. We haven't had an earthquake like this before. It must be connected. Completely understandable. I would say the same thing if I was living up there too.
We are calling on the Prime Minister to stop all these nonsense meetings. Government should engage an international body, competent body to look at what is causing this earthquake.
Although Geoscience Australia finally determined that the earthquake of February 2018 had natural causes and was not related to oil or gas activities, a number of myths and legends survive till today among the Huli tribes, including one known in the local language as Gigira Laitebo, the fire that never dies.
In the Huli language, the Gigira Laitebo should not leave its original place. It must remain within the confinement of the Hela boundaries. That is an ancestral legend that has been existing from generations to generations.
The name of the mountain is called Gigira. The word Gigira and Laitebo is attached to it. Laitebo means fire that never dies. And this is quite a spiritual site in the ancient Hela world when people would offer sacrifices of pig for that mountain. There were festivals going on in terms of rituals and worship. So when the earthquake took place right next door, at the epicenter next door to the mountain that was prophesied, there was a lot of association and connotations attached to prophecies being fulfilled.
In past times, whenever there was a drought or a natural disaster like this, then the Huli would attempt to perform what is called an earth ritual. Only certain people could go in, and once in those grounds, they would perform a number of rituals and offerings to the spirit, as well as, it is said, human sacrifices.
Papua New Guineans are resilient people, they say. But certainly, they won't be able to rebuild their entire communities alone. And a whole generation of Papua New Guineans may be at risk of being left behind. Plenty of schools, health centers, and vital roads need to be built again. And the real question now is how the Papua New Guinean government and the resource companies operating in the area will be able to help.
The communities we went into, they were really cooperating, and they were living together, and they were supporting each other as a community. And that's one thing too. I mean, PNG, it has its problems, but boy, it has community.
The task is going to take years. And what we've decided to do is start with secondary education in Helen and get those students back in those schools and teacher accommodation back as fast as possible. And the question is, do you fix them to the standard they were, or do you fix them to the standard they should be?
It's a collective responsibility to make sure that the challenges that those two provinces face be addressed. They just are not going to sort out themselves. If I'm not mistaken, again referring to statistics, some 30% of the national GDP comes out of those two provinces. I'm not sure how much of that wealth goes back.
The restoration and the reconstruction of many of the infrastructure like schools, hospitals and tertiary institutions that were damaged by the earthquake is the next stage of our desire to making sure that we restore services back in those communities. Now, the funding of $450 million that we have announced is over several years. It is not funding that was going to be made available in one budget, because we simply cannot afford that.
Will be sourced from the $450 million.
I think, all in all, government's efforts are there, but there's more to be done. There's no doubt about that.
The people up in the Highlands were traumatised by the event, and we know what that feels like in New Zealand. I know that from a personal perspective, from my own family who've been involved in earthquake in Christchurch. I lost my family home, I lost my school, both of them. So I know that personally. So it's not just the physical event and the immediate response. Sometimes, and more often than not, it is the longer term, medium term effects that actually need support, and the psychosocial support that's needed after an earthquake like this is as important as any physical assistance.
Some of our communities are still cut off. Some of our communities still struggle with healthcare. And we're working very closely with government as to how we can manage and help that process in terms of restoration, because, there was one effort, very, very intense effort around the immediate response and relief effort to keep people alive and treat their medical things. There is a much longer game around restoration. It's not a 5-minute exercise.
Rebuilding entire communities in the Highlands region of Papua New Guinea will clearly be a complex and lengthy exercise for the government of PNG. And the hope is that the restoration process will involve some of the local institutions and foreign governments who who were instrumental in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake.
For relief supplies.
Besides the fundamental role played by Australia and New Zealand, multilateral institutions and countries as far apart as France, Japan, and China, among others, contributed to avoid what could have been a much larger humanitarian crisis, proving once again that international cooperation has a reason to exist in today's world. If there is a silver lining to this story, however, it is that natural disasters tend to make us think deeper about the things that we may take for granted in life. And clearly, there are lessons to be learned out of this experience for all the people who were involved. In a way, it feels as if it was a wake-up call for all.
Take me home, country road.
If there's anything that comes out of the documentary, not just to record what did happen, but how we can be better prepared for any future disaster that might befall this wonderful country.
The earthquake enabled us to open wide our eyes on the situation on the ground and realize that if we do apply the principle that is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals, which states that no one can be left behind, then that's the first place we need to be.
The lesson learned from this going forward is how do we enable that, we are able to respond within an acceptable response time.
It's all very well saying, well, you were supposed to have provincial disaster stores. Well, who's funding them and who's managing them? It's not enough just to say you've got responsibility, but you've got to give them the capability.
Every period of history is, to those who live it, exceptional. It's those people, us, who make the next step into the future.
A lot of the people that sometimes are thinking so much material things before have now begun to realize that it's not just all about money and material things, it's also about the area and the environment you live in and to look after it and to sustain it so that our future generations still have something they'll be proud of.
What we as government are doing now, instead of managing service delivery at the national level, we're now sending funds straight to districts right across the country. So in the event a disaster or normal development needs out there, the districts themselves can be the first front line in saving their people.
It's one of those experiences that I'll remember for many, many years to come.
destruction is also extensive.
Entire villages have been wiped out.
A family is still buried under this landslip.
Nobody knows exactly what the death toll is, but it's certainly above 100.
Villagers have little hope of finding their remains.
We have countless children traumatized by the likes of something they've never seen nor imagined.